Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to the February edition of our Cornerstone webinars. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at the Center for Community Progress. Cornerstone is our monthly webinar series that equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Alan Mallach, who serves as a Senior Fellow at the Center for Community Progress. Alan is nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, and urban revitalization, and has worked with local governments and community organizations across the country to develop creative policies and strategies to rebuild their cities and neighborhoods.
Hello?
Before turning it over to Alan, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar hosts and all presenters. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. And with that, I turn it over to Alan.
Well, thank you, Justin, and I hope everybody can hear me. And
yes.
Yes. So, without further ado, middle neighborhoods. I'd like to start with a little history and a little background. I mean, what is a middle neighborhood? I mean, historically, if you look at American cities, these were cities that were inhabited predominantly by working class and middle class families. And the typical city, whether it was a dense row house city like Bridgeport or a more spread out single family city like Indianapolis, was made up almost entirely of single family neighborhoods, not fancy, not wealthy, but basically designed to serve a middle class and working class population. And these neighborhoods historically made up the majority of America's older cities. And they came to play a particular social role in an era before the automobile, when people tended to get around mostly on foot or in streetcars or similar things. They were compact neighborhoods. They had individual houses, typically, with private yards, but very close to one another, and with commercial streets rarely more than a few blocks away where people could buy their groceries, their necessities, their clothing, as well as where the men, and these were almost invariably men, could converge on the taverns after a hard day at the factory. In many cases, the factories where people worked were within walking distance of the neighborhoods. Another important thing to remember about these neighborhoods is that if you go back to the United States 100 years ago, or even 60 years ago, we were a country of married couples raising kids. And in the typical urban neighborhood, anything from 2/3 to 3/4 of all of the households were married couples, and about 2/3 of them at any given point were raising kids. The rest were probably going to or had finally just kicked the kids out of the house. So this was the sort of basic household type that these neighborhoods were built for, and it's reflected again in the small but separate single-family houses that were the norm for middle neighborhoods throughout the United States, or almost throughout the United States, because in the Northeast coast you have a 2- and 3-family house type, which was the alternative model. And another important thing was these neighborhoods tended to revolve around schools and churches. In fact, many of them had originated during the end of the 19th or the early 20th century as distinct ethnic neighborhoods. So even today, in a lot of these cities, one still sees the Lithuanian church, the Hungarian church, the Polish church, and so forth, which reflect this history. And of course, the public schools that were built, and as you can see, they were built to be really sort of beacons of civic pride almost in these neighborhoods, were another central part of the neighborhood's fabric. So to sum up, these were neighborhoods that balanced affordability and quality of life, and they were focusing on the young, moderate and middle income home buyers looking for a decent place to live and to typically live there throughout their life cycle. And there are many neighborhoods that still perform that role in today's cities. And again, as I suggested before, they take very many different forms. There's no one model of the middle neighborhood. You have different housing types. You have middle neighborhoods that are fairly close in, high-density neighborhoods near the center, as well as neighborhoods that are at the periphery of a city. You have, in many cases, a lot of the inner-ring suburbs, especially the working-class suburbs that grew up in the 50s and 60s, are just as much middle neighborhoods as an urban neighborhood. And then again, there are neighborhoods made up of a single racial or ethnic group, as well as many mixed neighborhoods. But the key point is they were not high poverty areas, they were not wealthy areas, they were not disinvested areas, nor were they opulent areas. And these areas made up the majority of urban neighborhoods well into the post-war period. So, what happened? Now, the neighborhoods have been under threat really since the 50s or 60s even. First, demographic change. Today, in the United States in 1960, I think about 45% of all of the households were married couples raising kids. Today, it's 19%. In 1960, barely 20% of all American households were single people, and most of those were either retired people or people who occupied what used to be known as the skid rows of America's cities. Today, it's approaching 40%, and it includes a large part of the young, relatively affluent, highly skilled population. Traditional working class jobs that sustain these neighborhoods, particularly in the factories, have disappeared. As income inequality has become greater and greater, there are just simply fewer middle-income families than there were 50 years ago. The housing stock in most of these neighborhoods has gotten older and in many cases obsolete. These are neighborhoods where, with few exceptions, all of the housing is at least 50, and in some cases 80, 90, and 100 years old, and very often built for tastes and preferences and resources very different from today. For example, a lot of houses will only have one bath. And today, many of them are suffering from deferred maintenance and need for major repair and improvement. Home ownership since the foreclosure crisis has gone down. And finally, particularly for urban neighborhoods where people are confronting issues of declining public services, school quality, and safety, the suburbs beckon as an affordable alternative. So all of these factors have placed stress on middle neighborhoods generally and urban middle neighborhoods in particular. Another factor which is important to bear in mind is that these neighborhoods tend to fall in the policy cracks. I mean, historically, ever since government started to focus on issues of urban revival, urban neighborhoods, and so forth, the focus has largely been on the poorest neighborhoods, the lower income populations, and not on middle neighborhoods. Now, that is justifiable, and understandable. I mean, those are the areas that clearly most desperately and most urgently need help. But at the same time, you have the question, if you have neighborhoods that are currently reasonably viable, still providing solid housing, solid neighborhood quality, and paying, a reasonable amount in property taxes and wage taxes and so forth to the city's coffers, does it not make sense to try to provide some public resources to arrest the decline of this neighborhood? I mean, it's the classic case of, do you provide resources to prevent the decline when a relatively small level of resources might actually do the job, or do you come in at a point after the decline has become manifest and extreme, at which point it's likely that any significant change to that area is going to require far more in the way of resources. So this is a challenge, and in an era of limited resources, it's not an easy one, but it's one that really, I think, needs to be discussed objectively and clearly, because they're important. For one thing, they still represent a major part of our cities, and they are very much, in many cases, the only truly mixed income, mixed race, mixed ethnicity neighborhoods in America's cities. Secondly, there are still places of opportunity. There are places where people who are moving upward from high poverty, disinvested areas can find affordable, accessible housing and neighborhood conditions. They are, in many cases, the gateways for immigrant populations in American cities. And then they are major assets. As I indicated, they still contain relatively high levels of home ownership, stable housing, tax paying, as well as physical assets such as parks, schools, and other public facilities that, add value to the city as a whole. So for all of these reasons, there is a compelling argument that whether it's local governments, nonprofits, institutions, and so forth, should be focusing attention on these neighborhoods. Now, again, they fall very different patterns. As I indicated before, they vary by location, they vary by physical form and housing type, they vary in their racial or ethnic makeup, and they obviously vary in terms of the level of social cohesion or disorganization that characterizes them. At the same time, they're trending in many different directions. Some, not huge numbers, but some are in fact trending upward and becoming what one could say is gentrified. Others are reasonably stable, at least for the time being. Many others are trending downward. Some have stayed for a long period essentially the same in terms of their racial or ethnic composition. Others are changing. And then some have become immigrant destinations. But just to illustrate, this is using one definition of middle neighborhoods, defining it on the basis of family income, where the income, in this case, I use the definition as the slide indicates, 100 to 150% of the city median in Baltimore, which is in 80 to 120% of the national median. You can see the areas that are in salmon, I think that's salmon, on the map are what you would call middle neighborhoods. So you can see they make up perhaps about a quarter of the neighborhoods in Baltimore City, but you can also see that in the surrounding suburbs of Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County, there are significant areas of middle neighborhoods, particularly in the close-in suburbs near to the city. And again, these are the suburbs that were built typically in the 1950s and 1960s. And this gives an idea of some of the variation within these neighborhoods. So you have neighborhoods that were row house neighborhoods, two-family house neighborhoods, and finally single-family house neighborhoods, your classic 1950s suburb. And the other thing which is interesting about Baltimore, which is for the most part a highly segregated city, there are 55 middle neighborhood census tracts, again using the same definition in Baltimore, which is again a little more than a quarter of the census tracts. Half of those census tracts are clearly racially diverse, which means that most of the remaining racially diverse neighborhoods in Baltimore are in fact middle neighborhoods. And that's, again, an important part of the urban fabric. So basically, the key issue here is that middle neighborhoods are moving in a lot of different directions. And again, there are a lot of different factors. I indicated a few of them: the demographic change, economic change, hollowing of the middle class, aging of the housing stock. But each one has a distinct factor driving its trajectory. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit on St. Louis, where I've been actually studying the middle neighborhoods a little more closely to talk about some of the patterns that have led to the variation here. Now, here are three neighborhoods in St. Louis. If you go back to 2000, from a market standpoint, they weren't terribly different. And as you can see, they all have basically solid brick houses as their basic framework. Baden and Shaw were built before World War II. Shaw is really a 19th century, and Baden a kind of turn-of-the-century neighborhood. Lindenwood Park, which is in the city's southwest, was built partly in the 30s and then somewhat after World War II. But again, they were all, in 2000, they were all middle neighborhoods. They were all neighborhoods that were heavily homeowner-oriented, had a middle class but not affluent population. Now, since then, however, as you can see by the numbers, Baden has essentially declined significantly. And houses in Baden are worth only a fraction of what they were worth 17 years earlier. In fact, if you adjust for inflation, $37,800 in 2017 is about barely two-thirds of that, about $20,000-$25,000 today. Lindenwood Park is basically holding its own. Houses are appreciating, not dramatically, but positively. And demographically, it stayed pretty similar. Baden has seen significant poverty increases and significant declines in home ownership. Shaw, on the other hand, has become one of the most desirable neighborhoods in St. Louis, and it has become a magnet for affluent younger couples and families buying houses. So three neighborhoods, middle neighborhoods 20 years ago, have gone through three very dramatic trajectories. Now, the thing is, now St. Louis is a very historically segregated city. And historically, well, I wish I'd included a map of St. Louis in this presentation, but historically, the downtown, the hospitals, the universities, and so forth are in an area called the Central Corridor that runs through the middle of the city. North side is overwhelmingly African American. South side was historically white, even though today it's about 25 to 30% African American. So What we see here is that there was a dramatic divergence between predominantly white and predominantly black middle neighborhoods. Now, I'll back up here for a second because I think this is an important point to make. When older cities experienced white flight back in the 70s, that created remarkable opportunities for middle-class African-American families who up to that point had been effectively pent up in ghetto areas because of segregation, discrimination, and legal restrictions. With the opening up of large numbers of previously white middle-class neighborhoods, the cities experienced a growth in solid African-American middle-class neighborhoods. In many cases, we've seen neighborhoods that changed racially from 1970 to 1980, but did not change significantly in any other respect, whether it be incomes, home ownership rate, family structure, employment, and so forth. And so almost every American city had a significant cluster of black middle-class neighborhoods that emerged during the 1970s. And Northside St. Louis had such a cluster. In fact, many of these areas in the northern part of St. Louis, like Dayton, had been predominantly white neighborhoods until the 70s. And these neighborhoods tended to stay, despite some strains and struggles, viable neighborhoods at least to the end of the millennium. But what we can see here is that the North Side neighborhoods, which were African American neighborhoods, declined almost across the board between 2000 and 2015, while the South Side neighborhoods, many of which were racially mixed, saw a very different pattern. Some of them, in fact, revived or gentrified. Many stayed basically the same, and only a few declined. Well, what drove the difference? One of the big factors was subprime lending. And in my study of St. Louis, I saw this loud and clear. As the slide indicates, there was a direct and powerful correlation in St. Louis, and we know this is true elsewhere, between the amount of subprime lending and the racial composition of the neighborhood. African American and Latino neighborhoods were singled out and targeted by subprime lenders. And the upshot was that when the bubble burst, these were the neighborhoods that saw the most foreclosures, that saw the most decline in house value, the most switching from home ownership to absentee ownership, as thousands of properties came into the hands of lenders and were then sold to investors. Today, these same neighborhoods that were impacted by subprime lending tend to be the middle neighborhoods that are most at risk and most in distress. But there are two other factors that I should mention. The first is that at the same time as all of this was going on, there's been a significant increase in African American suburban flight. So urban middle neighborhoods that were historically African American, whether in St. Louis, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, or elsewhere, have been harmed by the fact that the middle class is leaving and they're not being replaced by other middle class home buying families. In fact, the more as time has gone on, proportionately more and more African American home buyers. And this is true in recent years as home buying among African American families has picked up very significantly. But the buying is increasingly focusing on the suburbs and not on urban neighborhoods, and in particularly not on the traditional African American middle neighborhoods. So there is a tremendous challenge facing everyone who's concerned about these issues in terms of how to rebuild the market and the demand for these neighborhoods before, frankly, it's too late. So one further point, which is worth noting, is that here and there, middle neighborhoods have also become immigrant destinations. And in almost every city, there's at least one neighborhood people can point to which has become a center of an immigrant population. So in Detroit, you have a whole section of the city. It's in a fairly central area located up against the city's border with Hamtramck, which is coming to be known as Banglatown, where you have an influx of mostly Bangladeshi, but also Yemeni immigrants. In Dayton, a neighborhood known as Old North Dayton has become a center for a refugee population known as the Ahiska Turks, who came to the United States after a long and complicated story and have moved to Dayton and have settled in Old North Dayton. So this is another function of middle neighborhoods, though again, away from the coastal cities, which are seeing truly large immigrant influx, it's still a limited phenomenon in most parts of the United States. But in the end, it all comes down to a central question. How can we build or sustain market demand for middle neighborhoods? These are important parts of the urban and suburban fabric. They are challenged by a lot of the changes that have taken place in our society and a lot of the traumas, such as the foreclosure crisis and the housing bust and the Great Recession that we've gone through. But they still represent an enormous reservoir of economic, physical, and social value for our communities. And I believe that trying to rebuild the demand for these neighborhoods and stabilize them is a critically important task. So, with that, I'm going to open up to questions. As I understand it, people should be typing in their questions. I see 2 questions. No? I see 1 question. 2 questions. And I will try to answer as many questions as I can during the time we have, which is a little less than half an hour. And then what I will try to do, if there are questions that have remained unanswered, is work with Justin to identify those, answer them in writing, and have that circulated to the people who participated in this webinar. Okay, the first one, it's relatively straightforward. I say only relatively, so I'll try it, which is from Jenny Hope. Just please define gentrification. That's a good one. Okay, at its most basic nature, gentrification is a form of neighborhood change which takes place when, for various reasons, a neighborhood sees a significant increase in more affluent people moving into that neighborhood, which increases housing prices and puts pressure on existing lower income residents in terms of their ability to remain. I mean, that is the basic classical definition of gentrification that goes back to Ruth Glass, a British sociologist in the 1960s. I think it's important to recognize, though I'm not going to go into this in detail, that the word gentrification has come to take on considerably broader meaning in cities today. And it's often seen as a reflection of the power imbalance in the cities and the disproportionate resources that are going into some areas versus others. So it's become a much broader term, symbolic of power and resource imbalances in the city, which are often racial in nature. But at its core, it's about that one form of neighborhood change where more affluent people move into a neighborhood and begin to supplant the less affluent. Okay. Okay, I see. Is there some way to expand the Q&A box so I can look at more stuff at the same time? I'm having trouble accessing the Q&A box, except, okay. Now,
Hey, Alan.
I believe, and Justin, you can confirm this if I'm right, that we're going to try to schedule later in the year a second webinar that's going to focus specifically on middle neighborhood strategies.
Yes, that is the plan, to sort of continue this conversation.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to try to not to focus too much on the questions that have come in about, what strategies to use. Okay, but here's one question. I think there's a question what do you do in a city like Lima, Ohio, a small Rust Belt city that has had continued depopulation and sits on an island from other cities? Is there hope for these places? That is one of the toughest questions you can ask, because there are a lot of small cities that simply do not have the powerful assets of larger cities like Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, in terms of economic revitalization and regrowth. And most of those cities are very heavily dependent on federal transfer payments, Medicaid, food stamps, vouchers, and so forth, even simply to support their populations. So I think cities have to look and see what kind of economic assets they can bring to the table, and are there ways to at least provide a somewhat stronger economy. But at the same time, I think a major focus really has to be in these cities on how can the city, with the resources it has, create a better quality of life for the people who live there, and in particular, develop the kind of educational institutions that can help their kids do better, whether it means in the city or leaving the city. I don't know what the long-term strategy for places like Lima, Ohio, or Youngstown, or Saginaw, or Johnstown, PA really is. But I think the short-term strategy has to be one of maximizing both the basic quality of life and creating opportunity for the people who are in the city, even if it means that they leave. But that's an extremely difficult conversation to have. What do cities have to offer immigrants and refugees? Other than a house and eternal debt. Do the cities you mentioned prepare for these influxes, or were these cities looking for people to fill job functional vacancies? Actually, the cities like Dayton, Detroit, offer immigrants a house, a neighborhood, and a place to start picking up and putting their lives back together. And typically, the cities do not prepare for this. This is something, in fact, what's interesting is that as cities have seen that that immigrant and refugee populations can add value to the city, more and more cities, either through local government, as is the case in Philadelphia, or through nonprofit organizations like Global Detroit in Detroit, are actively trying to develop strategies either to encourage immigration or to foster greater integration of the immigrants who are arriving. So I think cities see, especially cities that have depopulated significantly, that immigrants can be a positive factor in their economic and demographic regrowth. The immigrants come to cities for all kinds of different reasons. A lot of refugees typically come someplace because there's a refugee resettlement organization that has an office or a base or something in that city. Immigrants typically come through a kind of a chain process. So one of the things is the Detroit area has had for probably 100 years or so, a significant Muslim population. And that tends to draw other people from Muslim countries like Bangladesh or Yemen because there's an infrastructure there of co-religionists with mosques, with halal food butchers, and so forth. So I think one of the issues, though, is do the immigrants stay in the cities or not? There was an interesting case in St. Louis. St. Louis got back in the 90s a very large Bosnian immigration, and they concentrated in one neighborhood in St. Louis and had, I'd say overall, a very positive effect on that neighborhood. And then over the next roughly 10, 15, 20 years, as they tended to settle, become more settled, more established, somewhat more affluent, they started to suburbanize. And today, what was a very distinct Bosnian neighborhood, let's say 20 years ago, is not anymore, even though many of the Bosnians still own property in that neighborhood. So I think immigrants provide an important asset for cities, and they're definitely worth encouraging. As I say, I'm going to skip over some of the answers. But I think this is an important question, is how can you, or is it worth trying to rebuild neighborhoods if the middle class is in decline? Who, if not the middle class, would be the market that you're building demand for? Okay. The middle class is in decline, has been in decline, though we can hope that that's not a permanent phenomenon that's been so baked into the American economy that it can't be shifted. Because ultimately, I think it's an extremely unhealthy phenomenon, either for a city or for a country, to become increasingly either wealthy or poor with fewer and fewer people in between. So that's, given that, I think there's another aspect to it, is let's accept that we have fewer middle class married couple families raising kids than we did 60, 70, or 100 years ago. And are there other people who would be attracted to these neighborhoods? There are some interesting examples of middle neighborhoods that have become, in fact, attractive, perhaps to young couples, even to single people. A few middle neighborhoods in different cities have become particularly appealing for various reasons, for example, to gay couples, and have established a character based on that demographic. So I think the question is to look at who is out there who could potentially be interested in living in this neighborhood or essentially making this neighborhood their own. And I think you have to really look at what are the characteristics of the neighborhood, what are the characteristics of the housing stock, what kind of amenities does it have around it, and then really try to see if you can frame an individual strategy for the neighborhood that reflects its particular characteristics. But I think the question remains, and this is something that is, again, it's going to vary very much from city to city and region to region. Can you generate enough demand to essentially save, if you will, all of the neighborhoods in the city that are at risk? And if not, who chooses? Because there is a real challenge here. And one of the biggest challenges is the fact that in most metros in this country, people are still building houses out in the periphery, and middle class and more affluent families are still moving further out, well over and above the net increase in the number of households in the region. So there's a huge challenge in terms of essentially coming in and backfilling demand for the areas that are being left behind. But I think you have to look at neighborhoods and try to figure out, is there a source of potential demand for this neighborhood? And if there is, how do I tap it? And that gets into a lot of very specific strategies that are definitely worth discussing. Here's another one. This is an interest. Will the trend towards reurbanization continue and help create more, why is my Q&A box won't let me see the rest of this question? Justin, can you help me?
Give me 1 second. I'm trying to see what's going on. Try using the actual scroll bar on the side of the Q&A box and see.
I have, and it basically the next question overlaps with the question I was trying to answer. I'm guessing that will the trend towards reurbanization continue and help create more? And I'm guessing that, well, when there's demand for middle neighborhoods or something like that. And I think one big area of opportunity does exist. I think there has been an amazing trend towards reurbanization over the past 15, 20, and especially the last 10 years in terms of young, highly educated people, sometimes called millennials, moving into cities. They are typically single people and couples, and they now represent a very significant population share in places like Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Philadelphia, St. Louis. And now an awful lot of these single people and couples will at some point start to think about raising a family and buying a home. And I think one of the big opportunities for cities, and I'm not sure that any city is focusing systematically on this, is to try to hold those people in the city to buy single-family houses in urban neighborhoods, such as urban middle neighborhoods, as distinct from simply leapfrogging over those neighborhoods into suburbia. And I think the way that's going to happen is obviously, marketing and information are important, but is making sure that these neighborhoods are truly competitive with other places for people who have enough money to make choices, which means, are there attractive school options? Are the areas safe? Are there houses that people can move into without the need for major repairs and upgrading? So I think that represents, I think the reurbanization trend is real, and I think it's likely to be sustained. And using it to benefit middle neighborhoods, as distinct from just downtown and a few nearby areas, which is typically the case today, is something that I think cities are in a position to influence, but it is not going to be easy. Is the missing middle mostly a phenomenon in legacy cities? No, it's a broad phenomenon in much of the country, but it works in different ways. And I would say there are three different patterns. In legacy cities, when we look at middle neighborhoods and the loss of middle class households and so forth, the predominant tendency of middle neighborhoods is downward. Some are moving up, like the Shaw neighborhood, but more are moving down. In a small number of cities, and I've heard these referred to as star cities, magnet cities, and these are the small number of cities that are growing very rapidly and becoming far more affluent, like New York, Washington, San Francisco, Seattle, and a couple of others. The middle neighborhoods are also disappearing, but they're disappearing because they're likely to be going in the opposite direction, because the influx of well-to-do or affluent people into these cities is so powerful that it is turning more and more middle neighborhoods into expensive upscale neighborhoods. The one area where the middle still seems to be intact, I would say, is in many Sunbelt cities. Places, especially in Texas, where you have a large, relatively new, and relatively affordable housing stock. And one thing that's very interesting, when you look at migration patterns into those cities, the people, in contrast to, say, Seattle, where the overwhelming majority of the migrants are affluent, and you're seeing a net loss in lower income people. In places like Dallas or Houston or Albuquerque, you're seeing essentially the people who are in-migrating are very similar to the people who are there already in terms of their economic mix. And again, even though these cities do not necessarily do a decent job of housing the poor, they do quite a good job of providing a pool of housing that's of good quality, that's affordable to middle class families. So the missing middle really varies a lot from one part of the country to the other. How important is improving the schools if only 19% of households have school-age children? Would you rank services like public safety and green spaces higher? I think public safety and schools consistently show up at the top of people's lists. And one thing to bear in mind is schools aren't just about educating kids. School quality is a proxy for stable property values. So an awful lot of people who don't have kids care very much about the quality of the schools in the different areas where they're thinking about moving, because, again, they see that the quality of the school is going to have a significant bearing on whether the house they're considering buying is likely to appreciate or not. And even though it's 19% of the population, that's still it's a respectable chunk. And by the way, that's the married couples raising kids. There's also another percentage who are single people, mostly single moms raising kids. Unfortunately, they are disproportionately poor, which is a whole other serious issue. But while that's not a large percentage, the fact is that an awful lot of American households, at one point or another in their life cycle, do raise kids. And so having neighborhoods that are attractive to them and have good schools is a critically important factor. That said, schooling needs can be met in a variety of ways. So, for example, I know in Detroit, many middle-class families who've been moving into the city nonetheless send their kids to suburban school districts because Michigan has a very broad program where school districts can opt to take out-of-district kids and get significant state money for each one they take. Safety, I would put up there with schools. Because if people who have enough money to make a choice between neighborhoods are not knowingly likely to move into a neighborhood where they feel their life and property is going to be significantly at risk, which means that both the actual safety and the perception of safety, which we know are related but are not always exactly the same thing, are both equally important. I think after that, other amenities follow, but I think safety and schools are the two most important things. But don't underestimate just the general quality of public services. I know from my work years ago in Detroit, one of the most powerful factors was in motivating people to leave neighborhoods was not only schools and safety, which were big, but the deterioration of public services. And when you start to see that you don't have working streetlights and the garbage isn't picked up very often and the streets are potholed and they aren't fixed and so on and so forth, ultimately you lose confidence in the area. So I would say public services come after that, and then other amenities such as green space, not any green space, well-maintained, safe green space, transit, neighborhood shopping sort of follow in their wake. I think I may have one more question. I'm trying to see. The problem is I'm looking at these questions, and they are not the kind of simple yes-no questions that can easily be answered, not to mention the fact that I have trouble. Here's a good one. With all the challenges facing brick and mortar retail, do you see these strips as the lifeblood in the face of these neighborhoods? No, I don't. I think today, a neighborhood, if it has other amenities and is a strong neighborhood and an attractive physical fabric, does not need to have a commercial strip within it in order to survive and thrive. It helps, but in many cases, commercial development follows residential stabilization and revival, because ultimately, today, most people who are not poor have cars. And once you have a car, you can drive and get your necessities at the supermarket or the mall or the big box or whatever it is, 3-5 miles away. So a neighborhood shopping center becomes more of an amenity, more of a lifestyle amenity than a true necessity. So with that, I will turn it back to Justin.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you to everybody who participated today. We hope you'll join us on March 28th for our next Cornerstone webinar, and please feel free to visit our website for more information on this and other upcoming webinars. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.